My name is Elena Marchetti, and at 37 years old, I finally learned what my own family thought I was worth. 3 days after we buried Michael, his mother, Diane, stood in my kitchen. I was still wearing the black dress from the cemetery. She slid a manila folder across the island counter next to a cold mug of coffee I hadn't touched. "This is hard for all of us," she said, her voice smooth as the granite between us. "But Stephen says we need to keep things in order. 2,000 a month and we won't have to sell the house out from under you." Stephen, her son, my brother-in-law, the probate attorney, had drafted it himself. A standard residential lease. Tenant, Elena Marchetti. Landlord, Diane Marchetti. Property, 214 Oak Lane, Redding, California. I signed it because I was 31 and hollow, because Michael's sweatpants were still folded on the bathroom floor, because I couldn't bear one more loss. Here's what none of them knew. I had spent 8 years documenting historic property claims for a living, salvaging century-old deeds from county archives, tracing ownership chains through fire and flood. And tucked inside my own filing cabinet in a plain manila envelope, I had kept the original quitclaim deed my husband and I signed 3 weeks before he died. Recorded, stamped both our signatures. No mention of Diane anywhere. When I finally slid that single sheet of paper across a courtroom table, Stephen went pale. "Welcome to the channel." Before I continue my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Please hit subscribe and like this video to find out how one quitclaim deed, filed 3 weeks before he died, changed who actually owned the house my mother-in-law charged me rent to stay in. The kitchen island was cold marble, and I remember tracing the vein that ran through it, gray, threading through white, while Diane set a document in front of me 3 days after the funeral. The house still smelled like casseroles I hadn't asked for and lilies I couldn't stand. Michael hated lilies. They reminded him of his grandmother's viewing when he was 12, the way the scent clung to his suit jacket for days. I'd told the florist no lilies, but Diane had called and changed the order, and I didn't have the energy to fight about flowers. "This is just to keep things orderly," Diane said, tapping the paper with a manicured nail. "Ballet slipper pink. She always wore that shade. Said it made her hands look younger than 72. I was 31 and hollow. The kind of hollow where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears, and it sounds like someone else's." Michael had been dead 72 hours. Glioblastoma moves fast at the end. 8 weeks from the last Good Saturday we had, sitting on the front porch with coffee, to the hospice bed in the living room. He died at 4:17 a.m. on a Sunday. I know because the clock on the mantel chimed the quarter hour, and I thought, how strange. It's never been loud before. "Elena." Diane's voice pulled me back. "I know this is hard. Stephen drafted it himself. He's a probate attorney, you know. He does this for families all the time." Stephen, Michael's older brother, he'd been at the funeral in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. He'd hugged me with one arm and handed me his card. "Anything you need, legal-wise. No charge for family." The document was 6 pages. I tried to read it, but the words swam. I caught fragments: lessor, lessee, monthly rental amount, $2,000. Commencing December 1st, 2019, $2,000 a month. I looked up. "Diane, this is my house. Mine and Michael's." She nodded slowly, the way you nod at a child who doesn't understand fractions yet. "Sweetheart, Michael's father and I, we helped you buy this house." $60,000 toward the down payment, you remember. I did remember. 2015. We'd found the Craftsman on Oak Lane, built 1923, original coffered ceilings in the living room, a fireplace with batchelder tile that made my conservator's heart skip. Michael and I had saved $22,000. His parents offered $60,000 as a gift. "A wedding present," Charles had said, clinking his champagne glass at the closing dinner. "No strings." Diane had smiled and touched my hand. "Our boy finally settling down. We're just so happy." Now, here she was, string in hand. The house is actually in the family trust, Diane continued. Michael's name is on it, but it was always part of the Marchetti estate plan. Stephen can explain the legalities better than I can. The Marchetti estate plan? I'd never heard those words before. Michael and I had signed papers, yes, stacks of them, at the title company with a notary who smelled like cough drops. But I didn't remember a trust. I remembered the recorder's office. I remembered Michael joking that we should frame the deed. I remembered the woman behind the counter, stamping something and sliding it back across the laminate counter. I don't understand, I said. My name is on the deed. Stephen appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee. Black, no sugar. He was 51 then, tall like Michael, but heavier in the jaw, softer around the middle. He leaned against the doorframe with the ease of someone who'd been listening. It's a standard arrangement, Elena. The quitclaim deed you and Michael signed converted the property to joint tenancy with right of survivorship, but that deed was subordinate to the family trust instrument established in 2015 when the down payment was made. The trust holds the primary interest. He said it so smoothly, like buttering toast. I looked at the document again. The lease. It named Diane Marchetti as lessor. It named me as lessee. It specified 214 Oak Lane, Redding, California. 12-month term, auto-renewing, $2,000 per month. Late fee of $150 if received after the 5th. This says I'm renting, I said. My voice came out flat, too grief-drunk for anger. How am I renting a house I own? Diane reached across the island and took my hand. Her rings were cold. It's temporary, just until probate settles. Michael's estate has to go through the proper channels. You'll get everything that's coming to you. This just protects everyone while we sort things out. 4 years, Stephen added. That's the typical timeline for an estate of this complexity in Shasta County, assuming no complications. You'll want to keep copies of the rent checks for your own records, of course. Rent checks. My own house. I'd been sleeping in the bedroom where Michael died because I couldn't bring myself to change the sheets, and they were telling me to write rent checks. I signed. That's the part I go back to. In the quiet moments, I signed. I sat at the kitchen island where Michael and I had eaten pancakes on Sunday mornings, where he'd proposed with a ring tucked inside a coffee mug because he said he couldn't wait for the restaurant. And I signed a lease that made me a tenant in my own home. The pen was a Mont Blanc, Stevens. He handed it to me with the cap already off. My hand didn't shake. I remember being surprised by that. I signed Elena Marchetti in blue ink, and the letters looked like someone else's name. Diane took the document and slipped it into a leather folio I'd never seen before. You're doing the right thing. Michael would be so grateful you're keeping things amicable. Amicable. That word stuck in my teeth. After they left, Diane's perfume lingering in the air, Stephen's coffee cup in the sink because he didn't rinse it, I sat on the floor of the living room. The Batchelder tiles on the fireplace were cool against my back. I stared at the ceiling coffers, the ones Michael had repainted himself in 2017, standing on a ladder with a brush and a beer, and I tried to remember signing a trust document. I tried to remember any conversation where Michael said the house belonged to his parents. I couldn't. Instead, I remembered October 11th. 3 weeks before he died, a Friday, we'd gone to the title company on Market Street, the one next to the old theater. Michael was in a wheelchair by then. His left side was weak. The tumor was pressing on his motor cortex, and he'd lost fine control of his hand, but he could still grip a pen if I guided it. The notary had leaned forward, her eyes soft with pity, and Michael had said, "Don't look at me like that. I'm just buying my wife a house." He meant it as a joke. The quitclaim deed, the one we signed that day, converted our property to joint tenancy with right of survivorship. It meant, if he died, the house was mine. No probate, no fight, no trust. He'd insisted on it. His parents didn't know. "They'll be fine," he'd said, squeezing my hand in the car afterward. "I need you to be safe." Safe? He was dying of brain cancer, and he was worried about me being safe. I got up off the floor. I went to the filing cabinet in the hallway, the gray metal one Michael had salvaged from an estate sale, and spray painted himself. I opened the bottom drawer, the one labeled property. And there it was, inside, a manila envelope, Stamped and dated. Shasta County Recorder's Office. Book 4521. Page 893. October 11th, 2019. Elena Marchetti and Michael Marchetti, joint tenants with right of survivorship. No family trust, no Diane, no Stephen. I stood in the hallway for a long time, holding that envelope. The house was quiet. The lilies were starting to brown at the edges. Outside, someone's sprinklers clicked on, a rhythmic chick-chick-chick that I'd heard 1,000 times but never noticed. Until that moment. I put the envelope back in the drawer. I closed it. I walked to the kitchen, opened my checkbook, and wrote the first rent check. December 1st, 2019. $2,000 paid to the order of Diane Marchetti. In the memo line, I wrote 214 Oak Lane. December rent. I photocopied it. Front and back. I put the copy in a folder I labeled House Lease, and I started a document on my laptop. A simple spreadsheet, date, check number, amount. I named the file rent_log because that's what it was. 48 months of checks. December 2019 through November 2024, $96,000. Every single one, photocopied front and back, stored in that same gray filing cabinet in a folder that grew thicker with each passing year. I never said a word to Diane. I brought the checks to family dinners, handed them across the table with a smile. She always said thank you. She always deposited them within 3 days, sometimes 2. Stephen never mentioned the trust again. The first year without Michael, I moved through the house like a tenant, which technically I was. Diane had made that clear. I stopped touching certain things. His coffee mug stayed in the cabinet, above the sink, third shelf, pushed back behind the everyday plates. His work boots, still carrying a fine layer of redding dust from the last site we walked together, sat on a rubber mat in the mudroom. I didn't move them. I didn't move anything. The house at 214 Oak Lane became a museum of our life, and I was the caretaker, curator who walked through it every morning in socks, touching nothing. Diane called on a Tuesday, November 12th, 2019, 9 days after Michael died. The funeral had been 3 days earlier, a small service at St. Joseph's with maybe 40 people, mostly his colleagues from the engineering firm, and a handful of my preservation friends who drove up from Sacramento. Diane wore black silk and didn't cry. Stephen stood beside her in a suit that looked expensive and slightly too tight across the shoulders, his hand on her elbow the whole time, like she might collapse, though she never did. I was sitting at the kitchen table when the phone rang, still in my robe at 11 in the morning, staring at a stack of sympathy cards I couldn't bring myself to open. The caller, ID, said, D. Marchetti. Elena, sweetheart. Her voice had that particular tone she used when she was about to say something she'd already decided on. Stephen and I are coming by this afternoon, around 3. We need to discuss the house. The house? Just some paperwork Michael wanted in order. Nothing to worry about. I worried anyway. I showered and dressed in clean jeans and a gray sweater Michael had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. I made coffee no one would drink. At 3:07, Diane's white Lexus pulled into the driveway, and I watched through the front window as Stephen opened her door, then reached into the back seat for a leather briefcase. They came in and sat on my couch like guests, but Diane's eyes moved across the room cataloging things. The built-in bookcases Michael and I had stripped and refinished together. The original leaded glass transom above the front door that I'd spent 3 weekends restoring with a dental pick and linseed oil. The wide plank oak floors we'd uncovered beneath 3 layers of linoleum and carpet, sanded down to the raw wood and sealed with matte polyurethane. You've kept it lovely, Diane said, and it almost sounded like an accusation. Stephen opened his briefcase and pulled out a document, 6 pages stapled at the corner. He set it on the coffee table between us. This is a residential lease agreement, he said. Standard terms, month to month, $2,000, due the 1st. Late fee of $150 after the 5th. I looked at the paper, then at him, then at Diane, who was studying the ceiling molding like she was appraising it. I don't understand. This is my home. Michael and I. The property was never in your name, Elena. Stephen's voice was calm, practiced, the voice he probably used with clients who came into his office frightened and left grateful for his expertise. Michael purchased it before you were married, and the title remained in his name alone. Upon his death, it passed to his mother as the sole heir under intestate succession. That's not true. We did the paperwork. We went to the county recorder in October, 3 weeks before. My voice caught. I stopped, breathed. There's a deed. Diane finally looked at me. Her expression was soft, almost pitying. Sweetheart, grief does things to memory. Stephen has handled hundreds of these cases. He knows what he's talking about. The lease protects you, Stephen added. It gives you legal standing to remain in the home. Without it, technically, my mother could ask you to vacate immediately. We don't want that. Michael wouldn't have wanted that. $2,000 a month. I did the math in my head while they watched me. My salary at North State Preservation was $58,400 a year. After taxes, health insurance, the small life insurance policy Michael had through work that hadn't paid out yet, $2,000 a month was more than half my take-home pay. I needed time to think about this. Diane reached across the coffee table and patted my hand. Her rings were cold. Of course, darling. Take a few days. But the lease needs to be signed by Friday if you want to stay through December. They left the document on the table. Diane paused at the front door and touched the wood frame. The original 1922 Douglas fir that Michael and I had stripped of 7 layers of paint. He loved this house, she said quietly. He'd want it cared for properly. After their car pulled away, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and read every word of that lease. It was exactly what Stephen said it was. Standard, legal, impersonal. Paragraph 14 specified that the landlord, Diane Marchetti, could terminate the agreement with 30 days' notice for any reason. Paragraph 22 waived my right to a jury trial in any dispute. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I made another pot of coffee and drank it black at the kitchen table while the afternoon light faded into the redding dusk. And I thought about Michael. Michael, who had sat in the same kitchen in September, bald from the chemo and thin as a boy, and told me he wanted to make sure I was protected. Michael insisted we drive to the title company on a Thursday morning when he could barely keep toast down. He wore the green sweater I'd given him 2 Christmases before, and it hung off his shoulders by then. I remember his hands on the steering wheel of our Subaru, knuckles sharp, and how he said, "Elena, I need to know you're not going to have to fight anyone." I told him he didn't need to worry about that. He said,
"I know my mother, I know my brother. Just let me do this." The quitclaim deed was his idea, not mine, his. I sat at the kitchen table the night after Diane handed me the lease, and I opened my laptop and searched the Shasta County Recorder's online portal. It took 4 minutes. I typed in our address, 214 Oak Lane, and there it was, the deed recorded October 11th, 2019, book 4521, page 893. Granners, Michael David Marchetti and Elena Grace Marchetti, husband and wife. Grantee, Michael David Marchetti and Elena Grace Marchetti, as joint tenants with right of survivorship. The document was 3 pages. I downloaded it. I printed it.
I put it in a manila envelope, and I wrote on the outside in black ink, "Original deed recorded." Then I went to the filing cabinet in Michael's study, the small room at the back of the house with the built-in bookshelves he'd made himself from salvaged oak. I opened the bottom drawer. Michael kept everything: bank statements, tax returns, the paperwork from the down payment his parents had given us in 2015, a cashier's check for $60,000 from Charles and Diane Marchetti, with a letter that said, "For your first home, with love." I found the original purchase documents for the house. I found the mortgage statements. I found the homeowner's insurance policy, and I saw that it still listed both of us as the insured parties. I took all of it and put it in a second envelope. The lease Diane gave me was in my bag. I took it out and read it again, sitting on the floor of Michael's study with the afternoon sun coming through the window. It was 6 pages, typed on Stephen's letterhead, Stephen T. Marchetti, attorney at law, probate, and estate planning. It stated that the property at 214 Oak Lane was owned by the Marchetti Family Trust, with Diane Marchetti as trustee. It stated that I, Elena Marchetti, was a month-to-month tenant at a rate of $2,000 per month, payable by the first of each month beginning December 1st, 2019. It stated that the lease could be terminated with 30 days' notice by either party, the Marchetti Family Trust. I had never heard of a family trust. Michael had never mentioned a family trust. Our deed didn't say anything about a trust. I put the lease in a third envelope and labeled it Lease, Stephen Marchetti, November 6, 2019. And then I did what I had to do. I wrote the first check. It was November 29th, 2019, a Friday. The house was still full of Michael's things. His shoes by the door, his glasses on the nightstand, the half-read copy of John McPhee's Annals of the Former World on the arm of the sofa. I sat at the same kitchen table, and I wrote a check to Diane Marchetti for $2,000. I dated it December 1st, 2019. In the memo line I wrote, Rent, 214 Oak Lane, December 2019. I put the check in an envelope, I sealed it, I wrote Diane's address on the front, and I put a stamp on it. And before I walked it to the mailbox, I laid it on the kitchen counter and took a photograph with my phone. Then I carried it to Michael's study and made a photocopy on the small printer he used for his work. I placed the copy in a fourth envelope, which I labeled Rent Check Number 1, December 2019. That was the first of 48. Every month on the 28th or 29th, I sat at the same table and wrote the same check, same amount, same memo line, same ritual, photographed the check on the counter, photographed the sealed envelope, walk it to the mailbox at the end of Oak Lane, the blue USPS box on the corner by the old magnolia tree, then home to make a photocopy, front and back, and file it in the expanding accordion folder I bought at Office Depot in January 2020, a brown craft folder with 48 pockets, one for each month. I labeled the tab with a Sharpie, Rent Records, 214 Oak Lane. I said nothing, not to Diane, not to Stephen, not to my own mother, who called every Sunday and asked how I was holding up. And I said, I'm fine, Mom, just taking it day by day. Not to my closest friend from graduate school, Marta, who flew out from Philadelphia in February 2020 and sat on my sofa and said, Elena, you look like you're made of wire. I said nothing. Diane came to the house often. She had a key. She'd always had a key since the day we moved in, because Michael had given her one for emergencies. She let herself in on a Tuesday in March 2020 while I was at work at the preservation office in downtown Reading, and when I came home, the living room curtains were different. She'd replaced the cream linen panels I'd sewn myself with heavy burgundy drapes from Pottery Barn. There was a new rug, a Persian-style wool thing in deep red and gold. The framed photograph of Michael and me at our wedding, the one on the mantel, had been moved to a side table and replaced with a photo of Michael as a boy, maybe 12, in a soccer uniform. I stood in the living room doorway for a long time. Then I went to the kitchen and made a note in the small spiral notebook I kept in the drawer by the stove. March 17th, 2020, Diane entered house without notice, replaced living room curtains, rug, mantel photo. Then I went to Michael's study and I sat down and I wrote my March rent check. I photocopied it. I filed it. This continued. In June 2020, she had the exterior painted. The Craftsman house had always been a soft sage green with cream trim, and she painted it a dark charcoal gray with black shutters. The painter's truck was in the driveway when I came home from work. Diane, what's happening? I asked, and she said, the house needed updating, Elena. It was looking shabby. The paint job cost $7,200. I found the invoice in the mailbox a week later, addressed to her. I made a copy of that too and added it to the folder. In October 2020, she mentioned at a family dinner. A dinner I still attended because I didn't know how to stop, because Michael's father, Charles, was a kind man who looked at me with such sadness. She mentioned that the property taxes were due. Don't worry about that, she said, patting my hand. The trust handles all of that. I smiled. I said, thank you, Diane. The next day, on my lunch break, I called the Shasta County Tax Assessor's office and asked who was paying the property taxes on 214 Oak Lane. The clerk said, the taxes are paid by the owner of record. Let me pull it up. A pause. Elena Marchetti, paid in full, October 1st. My name. The taxes were in my name, not a trust. Not Diane. I wrote that down too. The money was hard. $2,000 a month on a salary of $58,400. After taxes and health insurance, I took home about $3,600 a month. The mortgage on the house, the mortgage Michael and I had taken out together in 2015, was $1,350 a month, and I was still paying it. I had never stopped paying it because the bank statements came to my name and Michael's name, and I just kept sending the checks. Mortgage plus rent, plus utilities, plus food, plus gas. I was bleeding. I canceled my gym membership. I stopped buying books. I patched the soles of my work boots with shoe goo instead of replacing them. In 2021, I took a second job on Saturdays, leading architectural walking tours for the Reading Historical Society, $75 a tour. Diane didn't know about the mortgage. She didn't know I was still paying it. She thought the trust covered everything. She thought I was just a tenant, a grateful widow, a woman who should be thanking her for letting her stay in her dead husband's house. In December 2021, she came for Christmas. She brought a tree, a 12-foot noble fir, and she and Stephen set it up in the corner of the living room, where Michael and I had always put our tree, a small, crooked one we cut ourselves at the Shasta Christmas Tree Farm. She decorated it with gold and burgundy ornaments, and she said, "There, now it feels like a proper home again." I stood in the kitchen doorway with a mug of tea, and I watched her. I said, "It's beautiful." And the next morning after she left, I took a photograph of the tree, and I took a photograph of the new ornaments, and I wrote in my notebook, December 14th, 2021, Diane redecorated for Christmas without asking. Then I wrote my December rent check, number 25. By 2023, the accordion folder was heavy, 48 pockets, 36 of them filled. I had 36 check copies, 36 photographs, a log of every visit Diane made, every change she made, every word she said. I had the original deed. I had the tax. Michael's notes in the margins were in pencil. Check with Elena. Deed needs to stay joint. And below that, in his handwriting that was already starting to shake from the tumor pressing on his motor cortex, not signing this. House is ours. I sat on the floor of the walk-in closet for a long time after reading that. The shoebox was in my lap. The envelope from Stephen Marchetti's office sat on top of it. Michael had never mentioned a family trust, not once. In 7 years together, through the wedding and the house and the diagnosis and the morphine pump, he had never said a word about his parents wanting the house folded into a trust. But there it was in pencil, in his own hand, protecting me from something he'd seen coming. I put everything back in the shoebox, the deed, the photocopies of rent checks, the lease Stephen had drafted, the trust document draft. I put the lid on and slid the box back behind my winter boots, and I closed the closet door, and I washed my face in the bathroom sink, and I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were dry. I was 37 years old. I'd been paying rent on my own house for 4 years and 4 months. The next morning was a Saturday. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and wrote out a timeline on a yellow legal pad. October 11th, 2019, deed recorded, joint tenancy with right of survivorship. November 3rd, 2019, Michael died. November 6th, 2019, Diane handed me the lease. Stephen standing behind her in the doorway of this very kitchen. December 1st, 2019, first rent check cashed. I wrote down the Shasta County Recorder's stamp information from the recorded deed, the book, and page numbers. The date, I wrote down the total. 48 checks, $96,000. I wrote down the name of the title company that had handled the original purchase in 2015. The escrow officer I remembered. A woman named Gloria, with a smoker's laugh, who had walked us through every page at closing. Then I called Stephen. I didn't call Diane. I called Stephen at his office number, the one listed on the Marchetti and Associates letterhead that topped the lease. It rang 4 times, and I expected voicemail, but he picked up on the 5th ring, breathless, like he'd jogged to the phone. Elena, this is a surprise. Hi, Stephen. I kept my voice even. Do you have time for coffee this week? I wanted to ask you a few things about the house. Nothing urgent. A pause. I heard the creak of an office chair. Everything okay with the house? The house is fine. I'm just doing some paperwork cleanup, tax stuff. Another pause. Stephen was 43 years old, 10 years older than Michael had been. He had the same jawline, but none of the warmth. He wore polo shirts tucked into khakis even on weekends, and he looked at me the way an appraiser looks at a cracked foundation. "Coffee works," he said. "How about Tuesday? There's a place on Hilltop, that new roastery." "Perfect. 10 o'clock?" We hung up. I looked at the phone in my hand. My palm was dry. My pulse was steady. I thought about Michael in September of 2019, sitting in the recliner by the front window with a legal pad on his knee, writing, "Check with Elena, did needs to stay joint and pencil," while his brain was already being consumed. He had known. He had seen the shape of the thing coming toward us, and he had done what he could. Tuesday morning, I wore a gray cardigan and plain jeans. I brought my purse, but I didn't bring the shoebox. I wasn't ready to show my hand. I just needed to watch Stephen's face when I asked the question. The roastery on Hilltop was all exposed ductwork and reclaimed wood, the kind of place that served single-origin pour-overs in ceramic mugs handmade by local potters. Stephen was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table by the window with a black coffee and his phone face up on the table between his hands. He stood when he saw me and gave me a quick hug, the kind where only the shoulders touch. "Elena, you look good." I look tired, but thank you. I sat down across from him. A barista came over and I ordered a latte with oat milk. Stephen watched me order like he was cataloging the choice. "How's work?" he asked. "Busy. We're restoring the cornices on the old courthouse." "That's great. That's really great." He nodded too many times. His thumb was running along the edge of his phone case. The latte arrived. I wrapped both hands around the mug and let the silence sit for a moment. Stephen filled it, because Stephen always filled silences. "So what's the paperwork situation? I can help you sort out anything tax-related. You know I handle some estate planning, not just probate, but I can point you in the right direction." I took a sip of coffee. I was going through some old files, and I realized I'd never got a copy of anything from the court, about the house, about the arrangement. His thumb stopped moving on the phone case. "What do you mean?" "I mean the lease, the rental agreement you drafted. Was that ever filed with any court? The probate court, maybe, since it was part of settling Michael's estate?" Stephen's face didn't change exactly. It tightened. The muscles around his mouth went still in a way that was almost imperceptible, but I was watching for it. I had spent 4 years in this family learning to read quiet, and Stephen's quiet was different from Michael's. Michael's quiet was thinking. Stephen's quiet was calculating. "The lease was a private family agreement," he said. "It didn't need to be filed with the court?" "Okay," I nodded. "So it was just between me and Diane." "Right, a private agreement. And the deed, the quitclaim deed Michael and I signed in October, that was recorded with the county. I have a copy of that." Stephen blinked. His hand moved toward his coffee cup and then stopped, hovering an inch above the ceramic. "You do?" "Michael kept a copy in his files. I found it when I was cleaning out the office last month." I was lying about the timing. I had found it 2 years ago, tucked in a folder labeled House in Michael's handwriting. But Stephen didn't need to know that. I watched him process the information. His jaw tightened the same way his mouth had, a small clench and release. "That deed," he said slowly, "was superseded by the lease agreement." "The family arrangement? The house was always intended to stay in the family." "The house is in the family. I'm the family. I was Michael's wife." "You know what I mean, Elena." I did know what he meant. He meant blood. He meant Marchetti. He meant I was the woman who had married in and could be managed out. "Here's what I'm trying to understand," I said, and my voice was so calm I almost didn't recognize it. "If the deed was recorded at the county, and it shows joint tenancy with right of survivorships, and Michael passed away, then the house passed to me by operation of law. No probate necessary, so I'm not sure what legal basis there was for a lease at all." Stephen's face went pale, just for a second, a flicker of something I couldn't name. Then he smiled, the same smile he'd given me in the kitchen 4 years ago when he handed me the lease and said, "This is just standard, Elena. It protects everyone." "You've been doing some research?" "A little." "Look!" He leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice dropping into a lower register. The confiding tone, the him on your side tone. "I understand this is confusing. Probate law is complicated, and real property even more so." The quitclaim deed was meant to simplify things for Michael's medical decisions, but it didn't override the broader family understanding about the property. My parents contributed $60,000 to the down payment. You remember that? I remember it was a gift. They signed a gift letter for the mortgage underwriter. His smile tightened. It was a gift, with the understanding that the house would remain a Marchetti asset. There's nothing in writing that says that. There's the lease. The lease Diane presented 3 days after my husband died. We looked at each other. The barista was steaming milk behind the counter. The hiss of it filled the silence between us. Stephen's phone buzzed on the table, and he didn't look at it. Elena. He said my name like a warning. What exactly are you asking? I'm asking if you filed the lease with any court. No. Did you file anything with the probate court regarding 214 Oak Lane? The estate was below the threshold for formal probate. Michael's other assets were minimal. So there's no court record at all. No judge ever reviewed the lease. No one ever determined that Diane had any ownership interest. Stephen sat back in his chair. He crossed his arms over his chest. The polo shirt strained slightly at the shoulders. This conversation feels less like paperwork cleanup and more like an accusation. I haven't accused you of anything. You're implying something. I'm asking questions about my house. The house I've been paying $2,000 a month to live in, to your mother, for over 4 years. I think I'm entitled to ask questions. Stephen reached for his phone and slid it into his pocket. The movement was deliberate, a punctuation mark. I think we should continue this conversation with counsel present, if you're questioning the validity of the arrangement. I'm not questioning anything yet. I'm just gathering information. He stood up. His coffee was still half full, but he left it on the table. Elena, you've been part of this family for a long time. Don't do something you'll regret. I looked up at him from my chair. The latte was warm between my hands. Outside the window, Hilltop Drive was busy with Saturday traffic, people running errands. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I hung up with Margaret Chen's office. A mug of tea had gone cold beside my elbow. The tag from the bag draped over the rim like a tiny surrender flag. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to what I imagine a building feels when the scaffolding finally comes down after a 5-year restoration, exposed, raw, but standing. The intake call had been brief. A paralegal named Joanna took my name and number and a 3-sentence summary. She said Ms. Chen would review and call back within 2 business days. I had expected that. Law firms like Chen and Mosley don't leap for every caller. They triage. So I waited, and while I waited, I did what I always did. I worked. That week I was finishing a conditions assessment on a 1912 library in Chico, a Carnegie building with water damage in the East Stack Wing. I spent 3 days on a scaffold, photographing efflorescence and probing plaster with a moisture meter, and the whole time my phone sat in my back pocket, silent. I had turned the ringer off years ago because the sound of it made my stomach tighten. On Thursday afternoon, November 13th, 2024, I was in my truck in the library parking lot, eating a turkey sandwich and reviewing field notes when the phone buzzed against my thigh. I pulled it out and saw a Sacramento area code. I swallowed a mouthful of bread that had turned to paste. This is Elena. Ms. Marchetti, this is Margaret Chen. Do you have a few minutes? Her voice was low and unhurried, a voice that had probably deposed 100 liars and never raised itself once. I said I had all the time she needed. I told her everything. I started with the quitclaim deed, October 11th, 2019. Book 4521, page 893, Shasta County Recorder. I told her about Michael, about the glioblastoma, about the 3 weeks between the signing and his death. I told her about Diane showing up at my door on November 6th with Stephen beside her, Stephen in his gray suit with his leather portfolio, the one he'd carried since law school. I told her about the lease. I told her I'd paid $2,000 every month since December 2019, 48 months, $96,000 total, and I had every canceled check photocopied front and back in a shoebox in my hall closet. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. I heard a pen tapping softly on a desk. You have the original recorded deed? She asked. I have it. The one with the county stamp and the book and page number. And the lease? The document Stephen drafted? Yes. It's a one-page residential lease agreement, month to month. It lists Diane Marchetti as landlord and me as tenant. No mention of my ownership interest. No mention of the quitclaim. Another pause. I heard her breathe out slowly through her nose. Ms. Marchetti, I've been doing real estate litigation for 22 years. I've seen family property disputes that would curl your hair, but a probate attorney drafting a lease for his widowed sister-in-law on a house she co-owned, that's a new one. That's a bar complaint waiting to happen. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. Margaret asked me to send her everything. The deed, the lease, the rent checks, any correspondence with Diane or Stephen, any text messages or emails. She gave me her direct email address and told me to use a subject line with the word Marchetti and the property address. She said she'd review the documents and get back to me within a week with a litigation strategy. I drove home that evening in the dark, the road winding through Oak Hills, and I thought about the word litigation. It sounded cold and sharp, like a scalpel. It sounded like something I'd been avoiding my whole life. But I was 37 years old, and I had spent 5 years paying rent on a house I already owned, and I was tired of avoiding things. The next morning, I went to the FedEx office on Hilltop Drive. I made copies of everything, the deed, the lease, the 48 checks, and I scanned them into a single PDF file on one of their public computers. The scanner was slow, page by page, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. And a man in line behind me kept sighing and shifting his weight, but I didn't hurry. I checked every page before I sent the email. The subject line read, Marchetti, 214 Oak Lane, Reading, CA, client documents. Margaret called me back on November the 20th. This time, her voice had an edge to it, a quiet certainty. I've reviewed everything, she said. The quitclaim deed is valid on its face. It was properly executed, notarized, and recorded. Under California law, when you and Michael took title as joint tenants with right of survivorship, you became the sole owner at the moment of his death. The house passed to you by operation of law. It never entered probate. It was never part of his estate. Diane had no legal interest in the property whatsoever. I was standing in my kitchen leaning against the counter, and I closed my eyes. So the lease is a fiction. It's a fraudulent document drafted by an attorney who knew or should have known that his mother had no ownership interest in the property. The rent you paid, $96,000, was money extracted under false pretenses. That's potential elder fraud, Ms. Marchetti. Financial abuse of a vulnerable adult. Stephen Marchetti is in a world of trouble. I opened my eyes. May, outside the kitchen window, the camellia bush Michael had planted in 2017 was heavy with buds, pink and tight, waiting for winter to break. What do? I asked. We file a quiet title action in Shasta County Superior Court. We ask the court to declare you the sole legal owner of 214 Oak Lane, free and clear of any claim by Diane Marchetti or any other party. We also file a cross-claim for restitution of the $96,000 in fraudulent rent, plus interest, plus attorney's fees. And we attach the original deed and every rent check as exhibits. We lay it all out in black and white. How long will it take? The filing itself? I can have the complaint drafted by mid-December. We'll serve Diane and Stephen before the holidays. After that, it depends on them. They can fight it, or they can settle. But I'll tell you this, if they fight it, they're going to lose. And Stephen is going to lose his law license. I thought about Stephen at Thanksgiving in 2019, 3 weeks after Michael died. He had sat across from me at Diane's dining table and passed the green bean casserole and asked how the house was feeling, whether the furnace was holding up, and I had said it was fine. Everything was fine, and he had nodded and smiled like a man who had done a good deed. Draft it, I said. Margaret worked fast. The complaint arrived in my inbox on December 12th, a PDF with 28 pages of allegations and exhibits. I read it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and by the time I finished, the coffee was cold and my hands were shaking from the sheer weight of seeing my life reduced to numbered paragraphs and legal citations. Exhibit A, Quitclaim deed, recorded October 11th, 2019. Exhibit B, residential lease agreement, dated November 6th, 2019. Exhibit C. Copies of 48 rent checks, December 2019 through November 2024, each made payable to Diane Marchetti in the amount of $2,000. There it was, 5 years of quiet endurance, flattened into paper and ink. Margaret filed the complaint at the Shasta County Superior Court on December 18th, 2024. The case number was CV-2024-00892. She arranged for service by a process server named Ray, a retired sheriff's deputy who still wore a badge on his belt and carried his papers in a leather satchel. Ray served Diane on December 21st, a Saturday morning, at her home on Sundial Drive. I didn't witness it, but I imagined it anyway. The doorbell, the look on Diane's face when she saw a stranger with an envelope, the way her hands would have trembled when she pulled out the complaint and saw my name at the top and the word fraud in bold on page 4. Stephen was served at his law office on December 22nd. Margaret told me later that he called her within the hour, his voice tight and controlled, demanding to speak about the complaint. She told him all communication would be in writing. I spent Christmas alone that year. I didn't mind. I made a small roast chicken and watched the rain streak down the windows of the house that had been mine all along. I thought about Michael, about the way he had held my hand at the notary's office on October 11th, his fingers cool and thin, the pen shaking slightly as he signed his name. He had wanted me to be safe. He had done everything right. And for 5 years, his mother and his brother had undone it, one rent check at a time. The quiet title hearing was set for April 14th, 2025. Margaret told me to expect Diane and Stephen to respond, to file motions, to drag it out. She said quiet title actions could take months, sometimes years. But she also said something else, something I held on to in the long winter weeks that followed. The truth has a paper trail, Elena, and yours is bulletproof. I hung up the phone and looked at the shoebox on my hall closet shelf, the one with the deed and the checks and the lease, and I thought about how long I had waited, how many times I had nearly broken, how close I had come to just walking away and letting them have it all. But I hadn't. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at the Shasta County Courthouse, 3rd floor, room 312. A conference room with beige walls and a long laminate table and chairs that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. I wore a blue linen blouse and a pair of earrings Michael had given me for our 2nd anniversary. Small sterling silver circles, nothing flashy. I wanted to look like myself. Just a woman who knew what she owned. I arrived at 9:12. The mediator, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, had already set out water glasses and a yellow legal pad. She was in her 60s, I guessed, with gray close-cropped hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She introduced herself with a handshake that was firm but not aggressive, the kind of handshake that said she had seen a lot of family messes in her career and was not easily rattled. Diane and Stephen were already there. Diane sat at the far end of the table with her purse in her lap, a black leather bag with gold hardware that I'd seen her carry to church every Sunday for years. She was wearing a cream-colored cardigan, and her hair was freshly set. She looked like someone's nice grandmother, the kind who sends birthday cards with $5 bills tucked inside. When I walked in, she didn't meet my eyes. She looked at the water glass in front of her, at the window, at her own folded hands. Stephen sat next to her with a leather portfolio open in front of him. He had dressed for the occasion in a navy suit and a tie with small geometric patterns. He looked like a probate attorney. That was the thing about Stephen. He always looked exactly like what he was supposed to be on the surface. When I sat down across from them, he gave me a tight nod, the kind you give a stranger in an elevator. Patricia Okonkwo began with a statement about the purpose of mediation, about finding mutually agreeable solutions, about keeping family relationships intact where possible. Her voice was calm and even. She explained that anything said in mediation was confidential, that she wasn't a judge, that her role was to facilitate communication. I listened and nodded when it seemed appropriate to nod. My manila envelope was in my bag, a canvas tote I had bought at a library fundraiser 6 years earlier. I had carried that envelope with me onto the bus that morning, keeping it flat against my side. Inside it were the things I had gathered over 4.5 years, the recorded deed, the photocopies of every rent check, the lease that Stephen had drafted, a printout of the Shasta County Recorder's online index showing the October 11th, 2019 filing. When Patricia asked who would like to begin, Stephen spoke first. "I want to be clear," he said, "that our family has always acted in good faith. After Michael passed, my mother was concerned about Elena's stability. The lease was a way to formalize the arrangement while everyone grieved. We never intended to." "Stephen," I said. He stopped. My voice had come out quieter than I intended, but steady. I wasn't shaking. "I have the deed," I said. Patricia looked at me. Diane's hands tightened on her purse. Stephen's mouth opened slightly and then closed. I reached into my tote and pulled out the envelope. It was a standard manila envelope, 9 by 12 inches, the kind you can buy in a pack of 10 at any office supply store. I had written 214 Oak Lane on the front in pencil years ago. I opened the clasp and slid out the document. "This is a quitclaim deed recorded at the Shasta County Recorder's office on October 11th, 2019, I said. "Book 4521, page 893. It transfers the property at 214 Oak Lane from Michael Marchetti and Elena Marchetti, husband and wife, to Michael Marchetti and Elena Marchetti as joint tenants with right of survivorship. It was signed by both of us and notarized by Carla DeWitt at the Reading branch of North Valley Credit Union 3 weeks before Michael died." I placed the deed on the table. The paper had a slight curl to it from being stored flat for so long. The notary seal was a faint raised circle in the bottom corner. Michael's signature was there, a little shaky because by then his right hand had started to lose fine motor control, but still legible. Still him. Stephen reached for the document. I let him take it. He was a lawyer. He would want to examine it. He held it under the fluorescent light, and I watched his face as he read. The tightness around his jaw, the way his thumb traced the recorder's stamp at the top of the page. Diane said, "What is that?" It wasn't a question. It came out flat. "That is the deed to my house," I said. "The one Michael and I signed. The one that made the house mine when he died. You didn't know about it because Michael didn't tell you, and because I didn't know I needed to tell you. I assumed, wrongly, it turns out, that Stephen would have checked the county records before drafting a lease for a house I already owned." Stephen set the deed down. His face had gone a shade paler. Patricia asked if she could see the document. I nodded, and she picked it up, adjusted her reading glasses, read it carefully. When she was done, she placed it back on the table and looked at Stephen. "Is this deed valid?" she asked. Stephen didn't answer right away. He was looking at his portfolio, at the yellow legal pad, anywhere but at his mother. "Stephen," Diane said. Her voice had changed. The church lady softness was gone. Now she sounded like a woman who had just realized the ground under her feet was not ground at all. "It's recorded," Stephen said finally. "It's a valid deed." The room was quiet for a long moment. The air conditioning clicked on, and a vent above us began to hum. Someone in the hallway outside laughed, a short burst of sound that felt like it belonged in a different world. I reached into the envelope again and pulled out the stack of photocopied checks. 48 of them, each one copied front and back, each one made out to Diane Marchetti in the amount of $2,000. I fanned them out on the table like a hand of cards. "I paid you $96,000 in rent," I said, "for a house that I owned, a house that my name was on. I paid it because you told me I had to, and because I was too tired and too sad and too scared to question it. But I kept every single check." Diane stared at the checks. Her mouth had formed a thin line. She looked older than she had when I walked in, the lines around her eyes deeper, the set of her shoulders less certain. "You can't prove I knew about the deed," she said. "Maybe not," I said. "But Stephen can't argue he didn't have access to the county records. He's a probate attorney. Checking the title is the first thing you do when someone dies. The very first thing." Stephen said nothing. His silence was louder than anything he could have spoken. Patricia looked at Stephen and said, "Is that accurate? As a probate attorney, would you typically check the county recorder's records after a property owner's death?" Stephen cleared his throat. "Yes," he said. "That would be standard practice." "And, did you check the records for 214 Oak Lane?" A pause. A long one. Diane was looking at her son now with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between disbelief and the slow dawning of a very specific kind of anger. "No," Stephen said. "I didn't check." I hadn't expected him to admit it. I had come prepared for him to lie, to claim the deed was forged, to argue that Michael hadn't been of sound mind. I had brought the notary's contact information. I had brought Michael's medical records showing that on October 11th, he was lucid and competent and making his own decisions. I had prepared for a fight, but Stephen had just said no. He had just told the truth, or at least a version of it, and in doing so, he had pulled the entire structure down on top of himself. Diane turned to him. "You told me there was nothing. You told me the house was in his name alone. You told me she had no claim." The "she" landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. I felt the weight of it. Not Elena, not my daughter-in-law. She. Stephen didn't answer his mother. He was looking at the checks on the table, the neat rows of my signature, the memo line where I had written 214 Oak Lane rent every single month for 4 years. Patricia cleared her throat. "Given this documentation, I think we need to discuss the terms of a resolution. The deed establishes clear ownership. The rent payments were made under what appears to be a false premise. There are legal
Remedies available here. I had thought about what I wanted. I had spent months thinking about it. I could sue for the $96,000. I could file a complaint with the State Bar Association about Stephen. I could pursue
fraud charges. I had researched all of it, late at night at my kitchen table with a cup of cold tea and my laptop open to legal aid websites. But what I wanted, more than any of that, was to stop. I wanted to stop paying. I wanted to stop carrying the weight of their deception. I wanted to wake up in my own house and know that no one could knock on my door and take it away from me. "I want the lease terminated," I said. "Effective immediately. I want a written acknowledgement that I am the sole owner of 214 Oak Lane, and I want Diane to return every rent check she hasn't cashed yet." There were 3 uncashed checks I knew. I had tracked them. December 2024, January 2025, February 2025, $8,000 sitting in her account or her purse or wherever my mother's name is still on the mailbox at her condo in Sarasota, and I still send her a Christmas card every year with no return address. I'm not angry anymore. I just want her to hold an envelope in her hands once a year and know that somewhere a woman she underestimated is sleeping well in a paid-off house with a key she never had to wrestle out of anyone's fist. The county recorder's office doesn't send reminders. They don't call to argue. They just stamp the page and file it, and after that, there's nothing left to fight about. That's my story. If this reminded you to trust your own memory or to keep the record when no one believes you, take that as your sign. If you know someone who needs to hear it, share this, drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.